Hello and welcome. Today we'll have the pleasure to present to you our new report. The Brave Digital World. Is the EU ready to compete? I'm one of the co-authors of the report and my name is Adam Czerniak.
And I am the second co-author. My name is Miłosz Wiatrowski and I would like to warmly welcome all of you who decided to join with us today.
We'll start by presenting the report and then we'll follow with a panel discussion. So please stay tuned. In the first part of the report, we analyze the role of European Union technological companies, which we call EU techs, in the European economy. But before I tell you what are the results of this analysis, I would like to explain what kind of company we consider as an EU tech. An EU tech is of course a technological company. This means that it provides services over the internet as an enabling technology. So this is a company that offers goods over the internet, for example as e-commerce. You got the Polish company Allegro, you got booking.com, which helps you with the use of a mobile application to find an accommodation you need in a country you need worldwide. Then secondly, an EU tech is of European origin. This means that it has to be founded in Europe. Of course, it can have a headquarters outside of Europe, but the core of its operations should be within the European Union. And last but not least, a European technological company differs from startups. Of course, startups are very, very important for the European Union economy, but EU techs are scale-ups, significant and well-known players in their fields. Consumers do know their names like Spotify or Zalando, or at least know their products by name. So, how many of this kind of companies are there in the European Union? In our analysis, we took 28 European Union countries because we did the analysis with the data for 2018, so we had the United Kingdom included back then in the European Union, and altogether in 28 European Union countries there are 4,629 identified EU techs. The largest number of them is in the United Kingdom. Almost 1,000 entities are in Great Britain. Then you got Germany with over 900 companies and France with over 600 EU techs. The majority of EU techs are active in IT services and consulting. 29%, so over 1/4, produce software, and the rest is dealing with online services. Before I show you how much does EU tech weigh in the European economy, I would like to give you an overall view of what is the European Union data economy. The whole data economy within the European Union is equal to 2.6% of the European Union GDP. And of course, apart from companies that are of European origin, within the European Union there are also global techs that operate via a subsidiary that is registered in the common market, and there are also non-EU techs, as for example AliExpress, who is offering services to European consumers but without having any entity or subsidiary within the European Union registered. This is very important as each of those three groups, so EU techs, global techs with their subsidiaries and non-EU techs, is regulated in a different manner. And for example, non-EU techs do not need, or sometimes they need but do not obey European Union regulations. So now, what is the footprint of just the EU techs, those over 4,500 companies I mentioned before? Their total revenues are equal to over 400 billion euros, which is by coincidence also 2.6% of the European Union GDP, and they employ 2.2 million people, which they pay a quite good sum because this average gross wage is higher than the average wage within the European Union. They pay almost 59,000 euros annually. And also, they're quite good taxpayers. They pay 26% of their gross income as corporate income tax to local state budgets. The largest amount in comparison to the whole economy of EU tax is present in Luxembourg, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, Finland, and at the second place there is Poland. That's the country from Central and Eastern Europe that has the highest share of EU tax in their economy, and is also one of the biggest mother countries within the European Union, with 6% of GDP generated by EU tax. And now let's compare EU tax to their peers, so to technological companies that have a subsidiary in the European Union, because we have the data on both of these kind of companies. So, EU tax generates 73% of technological company revenues within the European Union. Non-EU tax, so those global tax operating via subsidiary, only 27%. EU tax employ 87% of people working in technological companies. Non-EU tax, just 13%. You might think, okay, this means that people working at EU tax are less productive. No, it's the opposite way around. Global tax, operating via a subsidiary within the European Union, just generate revenues that are transferred back home outside of the European Union, so they do not need as many workers as companies that have their core business located within the European Union. This means that the subsidiaries are quite often just facade companies that are needed to generate profits within the European Union to sell their products, but the core business, which of course means higher employment, higher wages, is located outside of the common market. And the same goes with taxation. Companies that operate in the European Union only through their subsidiaries pay less than 6% of their gross income as corporate income tax. That means that they pay less than 1/4 of the amount of taxes that EU tax pay to local budgets. And what's more, we say that there's less than 6% because majority of subsidiaries of global technological companies even do not provide any data on how much taxes they pay within the European Union. It's quite important to know that EU tax are leaders in sectors like mobile apps, internet security provision, or e-commerce, and global tax are leaders in developing operating systems for smartphones and also in generating search engines. If you focus only on e-commerce, you see that there is a growing amount of European Union customers that buy goods from non-EU tax companies, so from those companies that has nothing to do with the European Union, but which provide services or goods to European customers. And as you see here, in countries where there is a well-established local e-commerce provider, the share of people buying goods from non-EU e-commerce sellers is much lower. Here you have the example on the slide, that's Poland and Romania. What will be the position of EU tax in the future? Here on the slide you got forecasts made by IDC and the Lisbon Council, which project an optimistic scenario. The data economy in the common market will reach over 6% of GDP. But in a pessimistic scenario, in a challenge scenario, it will reach only 3.5% of GDP by 2025. What are the determinants? Which part EU tax will follow? This will tell you Miłosz Wiatrowski in the second part about legislation. I would like to underline that part that without providing support for EU tax, both financial and regulatory, we can end up in a pessimistic challenge scenario in which European consumers will be served by non-European Union technological companies.
We will now focus on how those legislative efforts and initiatives by the European Commission and Council and the European Parliament can help not only EU consumers to harness the benefits of the digital revolution, but also EU companies. First of all, in our report, we argued that the EU needs to be clear about the necessary trade-offs in its approach to the digital era. EU goals in the digital sector vary from the traditional ones, which include dismantling barriers to trade and creating a genuine single market, to a more sector-specific ones, such as ensuring strategic autonomy, which is a bigger concern when it comes to digital technologies. For many of them are so-called dual use. They not only have commercial applications, but also potentially military ones, with the key interesting factor when it comes to digital technologies are that whereas usually military technologies spill over to consumer markets, in the digital sector the relationship is reversed. Very often the innovations are first created for consumers to operate on consumer-centered markets, and then we discover that they also have military applications important for our economic and military sovereignty. And so this goal of strategic autonomy or self-reliance is something that differentiates digital sector from others. When we looked at what objectives, what goals the EU has to fulfill when it comes to responding best to the challenges associated with the digital era, we enumerated three major objectives. The first one, as I said, is the traditional one associated with the European integration. It concerns harnessing the digital age to strengthen the four freedoms, to strengthen the single market, to provide EU consumers with the best choice of high-quality goods and digital services. To achieve that objective, the traditional standard regulatory approach that the European integration relied on, which is mainly about maximizing consumer welfare, is sufficient. However, for the two other objectives, other regulatory approaches are more suitable. The first of the two remaining objectives relates more to what Adam Czerniak was talking about, which is ensuring the competitiveness of EU companies, making sure that EU consumers are not only at the mercy of non-EU digital companies, non-EU techs. For that goal to be achieved, a purely consumer-focused approach is not sufficient, and one that integrates also looking at companies, the EU companies' welfare has to be analyzed. And an approach that not only looks at consumer welfare, but also on companies' welfare needs to be adapted. The final objective is the one I already mentioned, which is strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, or any number of names that focus on ensuring that EU is most possibly self-reliant when it comes to digital technologies. It does not have to rely only on American or Chinese companies and their technologies when it comes, for example, to artificial intelligence. A preferred regulatory approach to achieve this goal differs very strongly from the traditional regulatory approaches of the EU. It relies not on free trade or maximizing consumer welfare, but instead on maximizing economic self-reliance, possibly through protectionism or even measures that may seem autarkic. So there is a huge difference between those three objectives in terms of preferred regulatory approaches, And for the EU to be able to tackle all three of them and to succeed in the digital era, it has to be fully aware of the trade-offs between the three and not push them aside and just focus on doing business as usual. Unfortunately, in our view, the existing legislative landscape does not adequately address especially those broader strategic concerns. Regarding consumer protection, one of the three areas our report focused on, the current decentralized law enforcement, the decentralized approach to enforcing EU regulations fails to ensure a level playing field between EU-based platforms and companies which serve EU consumers but operate from outside the EU, especially as their size and economies of scale allows them to pick and choose where to abide by the rules, especially if a country has a track record of being a more stringent enforcer, or where to try to ignore them, assuming that consumers will not bring legal action against the companies, against the global giants. So the lack of effective centralized enforcement is something that, in our opinion, is a significant threat to both EU online buyers, but also sellers. EU-based companies are usually more focused on single particular nation-state markets, and therefore they abide all the rules that are required to stay in the market for because their reputation relies on it. When it comes to the second of the issues or sectors that we looked into, namely EU's policy towards the digital sector and digital platforms, we noticed that the regulatory approach is strongly influenced by global giants that operate in those marketplaces. Whereas, for example, the platform-to-business regulation applies to almost all platforms operating in the EU, it is very clear that the platforms that the Commission had in mind when designing this regulation, when drafting the regulation, was clearly eBay and Amazon, for they are the platforms that enjoy by far the most asymmetric advantage over the sellers that they are serving. So when creating a regulation that is trying to address the perceived asymmetry in power and purchasing power between sellers and platforms, the EU focused on the most acute examples, such as I mentioned, Amazon and eBay. At the same time, the regulation applies to all platforms regardless of their size, as long as they have more than 50 employers and a turnover higher than 10 million euros, which means that this one-size-fits-all approach imposes disproportionate costs in terms of adjusting to the regulation for smaller platforms, taking away their ability to compete and innovate so that they can remain competitive on the market against those global giants. And this is particularly important because in the EU, as Adam Czerniak mentioned, eBay and Amazon are not the dominant companies on all national markets. In the Netherlands, in Poland, or in Romania, it is the EU-based marketplaces that are the market leaders despite their competitive disadvantage due to smaller scale when looking at Amazon or eBay. So those scale-ups are very successful already and have to have a chance to be even more successful by innovating and focusing on making their product better, while the current regulation is putting additional burden which makes it more difficult for them, therefore actually acting in the interest of those very companies, eBay and Amazon, that it is trying to regulate and it is trying to contain. Finally, the third sector that we are looking into is artificial intelligence, one where EU so far is mostly at the conceptual stage of regulatory efforts. And so far, those regulatory efforts focus particularly on the ethics of AI. And it is hardly surprising because artificial intelligence has very disruptive and potentially negative impact on our privacy, and therefore ethical concerns are very important. However, they are not the only ones. And here strategic autonomy comes back and has to be taken seriously. For the issue is not only whether artificial intelligence in Europe will be ethical, but also whether it will be governed by rules that the EU has created, or rather by rules that are imposed to us from outside, because the companies that will be dominating this market will be coming from outside the EU. In 2017, only 4% of the world's data was stored in the EU, even though EU's economy accounts for 1/5 of the global nominal GDP. And so instead of aspiring to catch up in the long term, because of the knock-on effect of innovation and because of the fact that current advantages in AI translate into further, even more difficult to catch up advantages in the future, the EU has to rethink its approach to data and to the sector and not focus solely on the ethics of it. To conclude, we offer 3 large recommendations, 3 big recommendations concerning the regulatory approach of the EU that should be heeded if EU is to compete in the digital era. First, on issues where EU's main concern is related to the asymmetric power wielded by the global giants, the regulatory paradigm should not be a one-size-fits-all macro regulation, but instead a targeted approach which really attacks the issues at stake and focuses on those few companies that are considered to pose a threat for the EU. In cases, however, where a macro regulatory catch-all approach is necessary, such as consumer protection, effective enforcement mechanisms have to apply to all companies. That should be the EU's priority, to make sure that when a regulation has to be a one-size-fits-all, then it also applies to all, and not in a disproportionate manner to the EU-based companies. And finally, in order to prosper, EU-based scale-ups should receive much stronger support by the European Union. When we look at the artificial intelligence sector, EU companies are critically underfunded, and therefore a much bigger role of the public sector is necessary. That concludes our presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention and invite you to our discussion.
These were just the main takeaways from our report. So if you would like to read the full report, you can see here on my left-hand side the QR code. You can download it. You can download it also from our website. And of course, there will be a recording of this presentation so you can watch it again. And now let's move on to the second part of today's event, to our panel discussion with our guests. So hello to everyone. Can everyone hear me? Please say a couple of words to me. Let's start with Martin Bailey, the head of Unit Digital Policy Development and Coordination, DG Connect from the European Commission. Can you hear me, Martin? Hello.
Yes, I can, Adam. Can you hear me? I can hear you very well.
Yes, great. Thank you for joining us. Then Gianpiero Lotito, the CEO of FacilityLive and the president of the European Tech Alliance, so the alliance that focuses on the EU techs we are discussing. Hello, Gianpiero. Can you hear me? I hope you can, but I cannot hear you. Are you there? I can see you. Okay, that's a good starting point. Great. Okay, maybe we can focus on that in a minute, but the other panelists with me. Eva Maydell, the member of the European Parliament. Hello, Eva, can you hear me?
Yes, sure. I can hear you loud and clear.
Great, thank you. And of course, last but not least, Magdalena Piech, Head of Regulatory Affairs from the Polish company Allegro, and of course also the chair of the EUTA, so the European Tech Alliance. Hello, Magda.
Hi, good morning. I can hear you very well.
Good morning. Gianpiero, are you with us? Hello, once again?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now I can hear. That's perfect. So, to give you a brief description of how the second part of the event will look like, we'll start with a short introductory speech by Martin Bailey. He has some slides prepared, as I heard. So, 10-15 minutes of introductory speech, and then we'll move on to our discussion. Of course, and now I talk to our viewers. You can ask us questions wherever you are watching. There is a possibility to ask questions in the comments, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. So if you have any questions to me or to our panelists, feel free to go on. I can see them. Okay, so Martin, the floor or the screen is yours. So please move on with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. So I will just share the content of my presentation now, and I hope you'll be able to see it. Let's see. So can you see it, everybody? Can you see it, Adam? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Great.
Yeah.
I listened to and I read the report, so I hope I will pick up some of the points here, and I'm happy to go into some of the findings in the that you raised. Maybe just one thing I want to say. I mean, I think I've divided into these four as was requested, but I would just say about that point about the centralized enforcement, and this is always, it kind of symbolizes the bugbear, if you like, always the tension, is that we don't have exclusive competence for consumer affairs like we do in competition, for example. And it's always a question, it's a wrangle between, say, the EU and the member states. And most member states want to keep the competence on consumer affairs. So to have a centralized authority is difficult. And I don't think that's a realistic prospect unless the member states suddenly change their mind and we change the treaties. And the other thing is, if you have a centralized agency, then that means extra resources need to be put in, and that costs, and that has budgetary implications. So I think one always has to be realistic, even as kind of very keen and devoted Commission officials like myself to the internal market, actually having these apparatuses and getting the member states to agree is very, very difficult. Okay, so I'm going to basically go through very briefly these areas, which I hope pick up some of the questions from the report. Online platforms. So a flash view of online platforms. It's the two areas, and the presentations already touched on them. We have the platform to business regulation. I stress it's not the only regulation. There are many other forms of regulation. There's the GDPR. There is the free flow of data. There's the consumer acquis. There's the e-commerce, and the e-commerce, of course, we have it tackles illegal content. We have the AVMSD. So don't only look at the platform to business regulation when we're looking at platforms. So these are the two main areas. So the platform to business regulation comes into force, I think, of the 10th. So this week. It's this balance we have to strike again between the beneficial effects of platforms, how they are good for innovation. Now, people may argue and say that they actually harm innovation, but this cuts both ways. We also have to balance this with their alleged gatekeeper role. Announced in the digital strategy was the main elements we're going to have in the Digital Services Act, which should come out later this year. The first is the illegal content aspect, that we want to kind of modernize the rules. So we will look into the areas covered by the e-commerce directive and also AVMSD as concerns harmful content, and also this part of specific ex-ante rules to tackle market power of gatekeepers. So the first aspect on the, if you like, the illegal content, as I said, the idea is to bring this up to date. There are certain forms of content online which are not, for example, strictly illegal, things like grooming and bullying online, that we want to bring in within the purview of the new Digital Services Act. We want to be able to regulate this rather, let's say, unpleasant or unharmful behavior. We want better coordination. We want better supervision across the member states to increase trust online. So that was the first aspect. The second aspect, which I think we're probably going to be focusing on a lot today, is on the fairness part, creating contestable open markets online. Here we will have, I mean, if you like, the platform to business regulation, I would disagree with the last speaker to say it's very onerous. It was a starting point of regulation specifically on platforms, specifically the platforms to businesses. So the businesses actually operating on platforms. And the idea of the platform to business was to inject greater transparency, inject greater fairness, for example, unfair terms and conditions where platforms, for example, could delist you without giving reasons, without giving reasonable notice. Within this proposed regulation, we're going to go far deeper into the tougher problems, also the systemic issues. We're going to tackle the gatekeeper. We're going to tackle, as it were, if you like, as far as we can, the black box. I think in the previous presentation, you raised a very important point about the knowledge we have, the regulatory oversight. Very often, we don't know what goes on in platforms. So one of the things we're going to aim to do is try to get much deeper understanding of platforms before we can regulate them. So there we may be looking at having, for example, powers to require information from large platforms that we don't have today. You have these powers under the competition rules. So as I said, the most important thing we want to ensure through the new DSA, the new platforms regulation, is to ensure the contestability of markets. Markets where certain players, a small number of players, may be said to abuse their market power in certain ways. Very important as well, if you want to reduce the risk of fragmentation across the European Union. You may be aware that a certain number of member states already have initiatives where they're trying to dig into the market power of platforms. We obviously want to have a more uniform approach across the European Union for more effective enforcement and to ensure a better internal market, a better environment for our own platforms on our own digital economy to develop. Of course, the larger number of reports from academics and other bodies and authorities who said that the competition laws alone cannot tackle these problems. You may be aware that we have launched a public consultation, and I would actively encourage you to look into the 57-page public consultation on platforms. These are the main building blocks of the platforms. To bring to your attention as well, we're not only looking at the gatekeepers, platforms, large platforms, illegal content, the governance issues. We're also looking at what we call platform workers, so how to address challenges around self-employed individuals offering services. This is, of course, the platform workers. This is the Deliveroo. This is the Uber drivers and others. As I said, the consultation is open until I think the beginning of September. So we heartily welcome your views on that, and particularly if you think things should be changed and how. The main things we will be concentrating on, and I read your report. You very much congratulated the work of DG Competition in the Amazon cases, the Amazon and the Apple for the state aid cases, and of course the Google AdSense, the Google shopping cases, where the European Commission imposed very heavy fines on Google. And of course, we're going to continue to apply competition law. But, and this may, I think, answer your one-size-fits-all point that you contest with us. I would argue against that anyway, because there is a lot of regulation that applies to platforms, not merely platform to business regulation, which is just a start. We will have this ex-ante instrument, which will contain some horizontal prohibitions, most likely. The ink is not dry on the paper. Horizontal prohibitions about particularly egregious behavior. And then we can also have the power, we are looking to acquire the power to impose specific remedies for certain types of platforms. So we set a well-defined circle of digital gatekeepers, those with considerable market power they can leverage into other markets. And you may be aware that at the same time we've launched the public consultation on the new competition rule, which will focus on specific structural problems in the market. Just a few words on tech sovereignty, which I'm sure we'll go into more in the discussion. The COVID pandemic has shown how reliant our economy has been in many areas of how reliant our economy has been on technology, on technological players. Now we're clearly using a platform. I'm using a US platform here. We want to stress that tech sovereignty is not about protectionism, but it's about having the markets open, keeping the markets open, and not being dependent where we can on third countries. And this will take a full European effort. Some of these issues and the investments required are so large that member states cannot do this alone. Absolutely key for us is to maintain or create our places in the value chains. We must be present all the way the value chains. I think you mentioned in the presentation things like search engines or operating systems. We're not particularly present in Europe, or else we have very small players. Two parts then on tech sovereignty, if you understand. One is about investment. It's about investment. It's about our place in the strategic value chain. It's the security of supply. It's diversity of supply. You may be aware of the 5G toolbox, which came out earlier this year. That's about ensuring diversity of supply and security of supply in the rollout of 5G technology. So we also want to encourage our own European players, our Nokias and our Ericssons, and not be wholly dependent on third countries for our 5G networks. I wholly agree with the previous speakers who talked about the need for investment, and this is going to be a huge battle in the MFF. But I think we will our pleas will fall on more sympathetic ears in the months to come, knowing the importance of digital services, which I think even the politicians have really been forced to appreciate. So we'll be pushing very hard for this investment for digital within the new MFF and of course a recovery package. Very important for you to be aware, if you're not aware, is the white paper that came out almost a month ago on foreign subsidies, focusing particularly on subsidies by third countries, subsidies and another form of financial and other help for acquisitions, for public procurement, and other areas where an undue benefit is conferred on a third country company. So it creates unfairness in the European market when they have to compete or buy a company. And I can go into that in more detail if you wish. So that is an example of the EU taking action to ensure fairness and the ability to trade in a competitive way in the European market. So we are tackling this. I'm just trying to slide. Okay. Very briefly then, because I don't take up too much time, to be important to realize these global trends, the amount of data that's being generated, the nature of how data will be changing. If you look at these 80-20-20-80 figures, how more data is going to be treated, to be processed at the edge, particularly with the increase of IoT, so moving away from centralized computing services. The amount of data being processed, we have this figure of we use this term zettabytes, which is 10 to the power of 21, how by 2025 should increase to 175 zettabytes. And of course, we look at the, excuse me, I'm just trying to break this, going the wrong way. Oh yeah, the value of data to our markets and the number of data professionals that we will need. Not being very, there we go. Again, the value of data estimated by PwC of $15.7 trillion. I think whichever consultancy you look at, their figures vary considerably. Small amount of European companies that are using big data. I'm just going to see this slide. It's blocked by one picture. So, there we go. Not forgetting that Europe has strengths. It has certain assets. So it's not all kind of a negative scene. There's a lot of potential. And I'd like to stress something we said right back in our midterm review in 2017, that we have very strong industrial sectors in Europe, the automotive, healthcare, transport, energy, finance, and these are areas that we will need to build on and need to fully digitize if we are going to fully embrace, and if we're going to the opportunities of digital, and if we're going to remain market leaders in the future. Interesting, the top European factors, half of them using AI. You may be aware in the COVID crisis that one of the, in fact, the most reliable form of diagnosing COVID was through scanners, so these CAT scans. Many of these are made by Siemens Healthineers, and they use artificial intelligence in these, which is more reliable than human diagnosis, in order to diagnose COVID. Of course, and I think it was stressed in the previous presentations that Europe is considerably underinvesting in data and artificial intelligence as compared with other countries across the globe. There we go. One quick word on the European strategy for data. So four main elements to this. We be coming out later this year with a governance framework to facilitate the sharing of data. And after that, possible Data Act. We want to inject money into data through what we call these high impact projects for the creation of European data spaces. So we've earmarked 2 billion of this across what we call the CEF2, the Connecting Europe Facility 2. We want to increase the competences, the skills for the data analysis, data processing, and we want to roll out the data spaces across Europe, key data spaces. And on this slide here, I show you what the data spaces are that we want to concentrate on. Of course, they're related to areas where we're strongest in Europe, and number one, of course, starting with health. I'm going through very quickly these. These deserve a presentation by themselves. Flagged up, of course, by the COVID crisis is the importance of data. Maybe if we certainly we had better interoperability between health data systems in Europe and better data access, then we may have had better results in the treatment diagnosis of COVID, or certainly the tracking of it. On AI, I said I'm going through very quick. I think there are two very important aspects to focus on AI. One is the capacity, the capability to produce artificial intelligence, and the other is how we regulate it. And so we have what we call, on the one side, fostering this ecosystem of excellence, creating our capacity in AI. Why is this important? I mean, I for one have always pushed the idea in all the papers that while regulation is important, we need to be making our stuff ourselves. Because if we are not, we will simply be buying, governments, local authorities, companies will be buying the products and services made elsewhere, made in third countries, because we're not developing them ourselves. So it's absolutely crucial that we develop our own AI products and services, and that we don't merely regulate the products and services made elsewhere. So I stress the importance of that. And this column here on the left illustrates the sort of actions that we have envisaged to ensure excellence in artificial intelligence. On the right-hand side is the underlying rationale, the underpinning rationale for why we want to, what it is that we want to regulate in artificial intelligence. Is this so-called black box. We want to tackle the predictability, the explainability of artificial intelligence systems. Just a quick focus then on the AI regulation. We'll be building on, if we have regulation in Europe, it's still to be decided. But if we do regulate, we'll be building on the guidelines that already came out earlier last year. We want to tackle fragmentation across the European Union, so we don't have different approaches across member states, so it'll be difficult for our own players to scale up. And then we'll need to look at what are the high-risk things that are high risk uses of artificial intelligence that are high risk in particular cases. So, for example, in consumer rights and safety, and of course in particular sectors like, for example, health and enforcement. Now, you've seen we've had our white paper, and the results for that we're currently analysing. And of course, there are different views from various industries. For example, the health industry may say, look, if we want to have our lead in Europe, and I think this is a brilliant example because it really epitomizes the difficulty of regulation. They may say, the health industry places that we want less regulation. We don't want high regulation in the area of health. Otherwise, we will never be able to compete against Chinese, Asia, and the US markets. Whereas if you speak to the politicians, or if you speak to the citizens, they will no doubt say we want absolute protection in relation to artificial intelligence for health. So that is a very good example of how difficult the debate will be and how we regulate artificial intelligence. So the health companies, many of them say we need less regulation in order to compete. Citizens and politicians will say we want more regulation in these sensitive areas like health. So please bear this in mind when you consider what we have to regulate in Europe, how we approach it. Finally, just a word on the future budget. I'm not going to go into details here. We of course welcome your pleas for greater support, greater funding in the area of technology. We will have to compete against lots of other sectors, particularly those that have been hit hard by the COVID crisis, whether it's the health sectors, whether it's the tourism, whether it's the transport sectors. But we will still need to invest heavily in technology, in our advanced projects, in 5G, artificial intelligence, in cloud, in high performance computers of this high level of technology, and also support to create our own ecosystems for innovation in Europe. I've been very brief. I've had to go very, very fast, but I was asked to cover lots of areas. So I will stop there, and I'm welcome. I'd be very happy to join the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for the extensive presentation. As you see, there are so many topics that you need to cover when you analyze the digital market that it's very hard to design all the rules from consumer protection to AI to data to funding so that you have one simple regulation as for some product markets. So that's a very highly regulated from different perspectives market. But still, there is one additional question I would like to ask you, because you mentioned, as I heard correctly, a draft regulation about ex-ante horizontal prohibition for platforms. Is that correct? What do you mean by that? And can you give us an example of how this horizontal prohibition might work?
Well, I mean, the draft at the moment, as you know, we have a public consultation open at the moment on platforms, on the Digital Services Act. Can you hear me well? I think my image has just frozen.
Yeah, I can hear
me,
you.
Adam?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
So
it's okay on our side.
So the Digital Services Act, it's open for consultation now. There's no draft act in existence. We are thinking about how we're going to put this policy together. We will fully take into account the results of the public consultation, but it may contain horizontal prohibitions for certain types of behavior of online platforms.
Okay.
But the aim is because I said it's not written yet. It will come out by the end of this year. This is why we're consulting on it, and I do encourage you to look at all 57 pages of the questions.
We will.
But in particular, it's extremely detailed, and it goes into whether we should have a European supervisory authority, what types of problems they are, what sort of solutions would you want to propose. But the idea is to have also very targeted forms of regulation, very targeted remedies in the case of certain types of gatekeepers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That fits. Okay, because that's a very important part, and this whole new act that is under public consultation is very important because it also is quite opposing, or in some cases opposing, to what our recommendation is, to move away from a macro regulation, one-size-fits-all regulation, to a more targeted micro kind of regulation instead of some kind of horizontal prohibition. Yeah. So that is very important. And okay, so my question to other panelists is what kind of alternatives to the one-size-fits-all approach do we have at this moment, and is it possible to achieve it? So to not have some kind of horizontal prohibition, but to target companies target actions that are prohibited. Maybe let's start with Magda Piech from Allegro, who was the partner of our report. You should turn on the microphone, I think, so we can hear you.
Yes, good morning.
Okay, morning once again.
Morning once again. So first of all, I think that there's an agreement in general that one-size-fits-all approach, it's not a good solution. And I would argue here that a number of regulations that we've seen has been taking into account this proportionality principle. To my understanding, this ex-ante proposal also goes into that direction, that there's a specific measures that are needed for specific situations. So I would welcome these public consultations and this reflection. I think that as a general remark, I would say when we discuss the regulation of tech companies, we need to bear in mind that this term is very broad, and we need to be very conscious in defining it. And more and more companies are tech companies in itself or are tech enabled. And I would argue that in some years' time, a tech company would be simply a synonym of a company, and let's hope for that. Secondly, I see a lot of differences between tech companies. So to compare a company that I represent, which is an online marketplace, which facilitates the transactions between sellers and buyers and operates in one country. We as a tech company and the regulation that applies to us are and has to be very different from a company that Martin gave as an example in his presentation. So let's say a health company, a tech company that deals with health data, for example, with the use of advanced AI, and that operates in a number of member states. So these regulations naturally have to be very different, and to some extent they already apply. I think that actually, when we discuss, how to regulate tech companies, we to some extent refer to how to address the challenges that digital economy today is posing. And I think, Martin, you described it very well in your presentation. And among issues that I would add to what you've said would be, of course, fair contribution to economies, which is related to taxation. So we're still looking for answers on how to redesign the tax system so that the companies that are not that do not have permanent residence for tax purpose in the European Union pay the fair share of taxes, which currently is not often the case. Secondly, there's an issue of how to collect taxes from goods coming from third countries, and this is the topic that is very dear to companies that are operating in e-commerce sector. Another challenge and issue when we discuss about regulation is the matter of effective enforcement, and I think it was mentioned in both presentations. So how do we make sure that the rules that European Union establishes are applicable but also enforceable to all the players that are on the European market? And last but not least, competition challenges. So how to address competition distortion, or the situation that, for example, was described recently in the UK Competition and Market Authority, which describes how dominated UK market is when it comes to digital online advertising. So I think this discussion has been ongoing on challenges and on the right approach. And I think that, of course, there's no one size fit all as a right solution. And I believe that given the current approach of the European Union, we will find the right, or the European Commission, European legislators will find the right solution to address these challenges.
Thank you, Magda. You addressed a very important point we mentioned earlier, so to enforcement. How to ensure that the law that is already accepted by the European Commission and the directives that are introduced in member state countries are enforced, and companies that offer their products or services within the European Union have to obey it. And here there is a very important also notion that Martin made, that there is a lot of regulatory oversight within the member state countries, and the regulations of member state countries differ, which also harms to some extent the enforcement of EU regulations. And I would like to turn to Eva Maydell from the European Parliament to ask whether there is some plan to give more power to the European Commission from member states on regulation of the digital single market, and if not, how the European Parliament can help to enforce the regulations at this moment so that there are no breaches made by non-EU tax.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Well, that's in a way $1 million question. How do we make sure that regulation could be properly enforced and fulfilled in a way? But I mean, let's put it in one sentence. I mean, I believe that the implementation of these EU rules is absolutely key. Of course, we not just debate them, vote them, but we want to see them enforced when necessary. But of course, well-implemented rules by member states and stakeholders affected are, of course, the precondition for this seamless digital single market. And as Magda was saying earlier, as she wants to just one day us to refer to companies by default, knowing that they're digital, I hope that at some point we'll be referring to the single market also, not necessarily having to specify the digital part. But anyhow, I think this is why when major legislation is basically adopted, we need implementation guidelines to immediately start being drafted. Probably you recall that there had been certain delays in the GDPR guidelines coming only a few months before the entry into force. Nevertheless, I think this was of an immense help when it came to the work of SMEs and businesses in order to implement it. So I'll stop here, but I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Sticking to this topic, I would like to give the floor to Gianpiero, who is active in many European Union countries, and maybe you can share some thoughts on how to enforce regulation. Maybe you have some examples of countries that are leaders, some case studies that are leaders of how to adopt EU regulations in that way that the local markets are highly protected, consumers are highly protected, but everyone has the same competitive power when it comes down to regulations.
But the challenge that we have in Europe is historical because we are in a paradigm shift period. The COVID lesson is very important because COVID gave an awareness to the people, to the European citizens about the digital needs that was unprecedented. So what we need now is to understand how to empower this very unprecedented situation using best practice, as you are telling. We have examples in Europe, like Booking.com, that is a company that born in a small city in Holland, in Netherlands, and became global. And of course, with the previous situation in the digital arena. So now we need a different consideration between the companies and institution, European institution, because we need to have a different possibility to compete. What I mean, for example, why do not create, like in all the situations where we have a seminal possibility, a round table between some people from the Commission and companies, commissioner, for example, why don't create something that will establish new rules? Sorry, but I have a cat that has
Don't worry.
a name. The name is Live, and sometimes she decides to be live with me. Sorry.
She's live, you can tell her.
Yeah, this is one thing. Another thing is that we need, until now, the rules about the digital arena were against to. No, we need rules in favor of. There is a different, really different situation for a regulation, because we need something that can help European companies that are not only the web companies, because there is also the need of a digital industry that will help the other industry to be on the forefront of the world innovation. So we have two different digital environments to be care: the web digital environment and the B2B digital environment, to have the most efficient digital industry in Europe. So a CEO roundtable with the Commission can be a good seminal and different idea. CEO roundtable with the European CEO. CEOs of the high-tech companies that speak about this directly with the Commission. And I think that if we will be brave on these things in Europe, we will have the possibility to be leader, because we need to remember that Europe is the first market in the world. We are the first exporter and the first importer, and we need to believe, to trust that we can arrive at the end of this journey winning and being leaders. And digital industry is probably the main trigger to arrive there.
Thank you, Gianpiero. You made a very important point, I think, that we need also rules in favor of something. As Martin explained, all the new drafted or consulted acts and regulations, they are mainly concentrated on prohibition, protection, so rules against. So, Martin, that is a tough question for you now. What kind of rules in favor of the digital market and EU technological companies are there in the European Commission mindset, or in those acts that you were discussing earlier? Apart from funding, we will come back to funding, because of course funding is in favor, but regulations, institutional environment that is in favor of EU tax. Martin, are you with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful.
Good. Well, I mean, I would just say, I mean, clearly there is a focus of the Digital Services Act to to target some of the most egregious forms of abuses. I said principally for limited number of players. Could I stress as well that we're not targeting small companies? in areas of illegal content. If you have harmful images or legal content and you are a small company, I mean, if you have pictures of young women slitting their wrists, abusing, we will also, which currently is I don't want to say allowed, but I mean there's certainly been many cases of this in grooming and bullying. We will also target that behavior, whether you're a big company or a small company, because this is sorts of behavior that we don't think is fair online. I would just say that as brackets. So not all companies are going to be exempt, clearly. The other thing is that we want to preserve the freedoms of the current e-commerce directive. This is absolutely vital, and we've been very clear in our statements to member states in the Council conclusions, for example. The recent Council conclusion is that we want to preserve the country of origin. That means that, principally in Articles 3 and 4 of the current e-commerce directive, that where a company lawfully establishes and launches activities and services in one member state, then they must be recognized in another member state. So we feel that this preservation of the conservation, that to preserve the principle of the country of origin and not move to a country of destination, this is absolutely key. Another thing I want to stress is that regulation of itself, because there are many companies that call for more regulation, particularly smaller platforms, this of itself will not create innovation. We cannot, if you like, regulate to death the large American players in the hope that this will give us innovation by itself. What it can do is, and I think it will definitely will do, is create the environment for contestability, which is currently undermined, and fairness in the market. We need to make these markets contestable, and that's one of the things by if you like, clipping the wings of some of the most egregious practices of the larger players. We will seek to ensure this fairness and contestability in the market. But I stress again that regulation of itself does not directly lead to innovation. And my personal view is that we will need also to think, and you didn't want to touch on it, but I will, on areas of funding and other areas of support, and really creating those ecosystems in Europe, like you have in certain capitals or certain cities. And if you take Cluj, Napoca in Romania, these ecosystems which can lead and nurture innovation.
Okay, and one last tricky question. Would you invite CEOs from EUTA for a seminar, as Gianpiero advised?
Would I invite them for a seminar?
Yeah. So to discuss B2B environmental regulations and what to change. So what are the needs of CEOs from EUTA?
Well, I mean, as I said, currently we have we have the online public consultation on the DSA, but the Commission participates in and runs a huge amount of seminars over the year, and we take part in workshops. So whether I myself will organize a seminar, I don't know, but certainly when we form regulations and rules, we have a lot of sort of physical consultations as well. My door is always open, and I'm always happy to, as Eva Maydell knows, I'm very happy to speak to companies and discuss the issues.
Thank you, Martin.
Can I briefly chip in, please?
Yes. Well, I wanted to have a question for you, but go on, and then I ask you the question I have for you. Go on. Yeah,
thank you so much. I didn't didn't want to chip in to say that Martin indeed is very open to meet all stakeholders, as I've known him for quite some time now, and we had a successful collaboration. What I wanted to add is something that was touched upon by the previous speakers, and it's of course related to this one-size-fits-all approach. I think that throughout the pandemic, there was a positive moment, and I hope we could build on it. And what I mean is a couple of things. I think that European citizens were able to understand in more broad ways what sort of tech companies we actually have in Europe that actually, empowering our societies and our businesses goes beyond owning a Zoom account, so to say, and that actually harnessing data could help us to make much faster, much better, but also much more informed decision. I think that many businesses that digitalization is absolutely the key and the difference between them surviving or not being able to survive. And don't mean that they move their meetings online. What I mean is enabling key processes into their businesses with technologies. And I think it's a good reality that we are currently finding ourselves, especially when we speak about the tech sector, of course, because it has not just helped us keep, but it has showed more Europeans about the many available solutions that were not put down in practice in a broader sense, of course, when it comes to big data, when it comes to cloud, when it comes to 3D printing and many others. And many of those were predominantly and are predominantly supplied by EU companies that came in to help to authorities in tackling the COVID-19 outbreak. And I think that, also with your report and the companies that you're in touch, you have to build on that momentum in order to make sure to continue showing the vibrant and particularly the EU tech sector has to offer. The reason why I say this is that indeed a lot of the legislation we have been working on and spending energy and times was to focus to rule against something. I think very often we've missed to further enable European SMEs and scale-ups and startups, not just through funding, but through also other measures. And this is something I hear in every discussion that I attend with European businesses, from the tech sector. I think we have to learn not to repeat that in forthcoming legislation. And I think, for example, the data strategy that Martin touched upon and explained what is about to come within its domain could very much focus in enabling rather than restricting. I would be part of the team that will work on that strategy in the industry committee. So or ideas of how to better use this legislative, one of this legislative document, but not only as an enabler for European SMEs will be very helpful. And I also want to make a point, because the budget was mentioned in the recovery plan as well. I think it will be very important. Also has European companies at heart. On one hand, one could say, yes, the tech companies, there's certain allocated resources for them. But on the other hand, whatever type of company you are, you need to enhance your processes in order to be prepared for the next challenge that will come and approach us. The more technological solutions companies have implemented, the better prepared they are for future challenges. So a lot of these resources could also go into enabling those more traditional companies in order for them to be better prepared and enhanced. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Could you share with us some ideas of regulations or certain regulations that would enable the growth of the EU data economy? Maybe you have some examples from the COVID period of how to help companies and become more digitalized. And what kind of experience from this pandemic times you would like to introduce into the legislation on the data strategy you are working on?
Well, I first of all think when it comes to data sharing, we need to make a disclaimer that does not mean that we need to open up everything with no regard to privacy or trade secrets or patents or data protection. I think that standing legislation in the EU must be very coherent to the data sharing ambition we basically have, especially taking into account the Generation EU plan, which is the recovery plan. This is why I think there is a good sense that I get from the Commission approach when it comes to analyze already distinct instruments. And these are namely the free flow of data, the GDPR, the Open Data Directive, and sectorial legislation with data sharing clauses. I think we have to move away from the mantra that data sharing is difficult because GDPR does not. In the implementation report that was, I think, published about 10 days ago or so, we saw that data transfers and sharing is possible, but we need clear guidelines, especially when it comes for SMEs, guidelines that provide certainty that could incentivize data sharing across the board. We also, as it was mentioned, it's part of the plan, we need data spaces so that we could pool the data, analyze it, create value out of it, make decisions, reuse it. And I think availability and access to data would allow basically bright entrepreneurs create services, different products, and importantly, generate a value for the global economy. There's plenty of reports that show, for example, how beneficial the European app ecosystem is and the revenues it creates. But if we make basically the functioning easier for the data ecosystem in Europe, I'm certain that all these developers, for example, could be having many more successful stories, and cooperation, most importantly, between innovative startups, but also established companies, and why not governments, will also be more involved, and them sharing their data as well. I think the data availability could basically be in a way and seen as a bracket, as a agreement for basically the data economy. So this is why the data governance framework will be so important to be set and implemented in the spirit of enabling secure data flows across industries, but also economic actors.
Thank you a lot. As you hear, both the European Commission and European Parliament is stressing funds and helping the EU tax in growing throughout different kind of regulations. And from that point of view, I would like to ask Magda Piech on what kind of funding or help, financial aid, is most important for EU tax? What kind of funding do you need? Is it more like infrastructure funding that the EU will help to build a 5G infrastructure, or more is it consumer education, or is it just subsidies for companies which were also mentioned before? What kind of regulations, what kind of funding is needed by EU tax most? We need your microphone again to be turned on. Okay.
So
Thank you.
I think that all the purposes that were mentioned, that by you, but also previously in Martin's presentation, I think they rightly identify where European Union should support both SME scale-ups or bigger initiatives. But if you allow, I would be very happy to come back to this previous question somehow by saying that I think that financing is one part of the solution, but the second part is the framework in which we operate, and I think that now what is key is that the challenges that we've been identifying are rightly addressed as soon as possible, and this also, of course, goes through enforcement. And we've discussed the right approach the European Union should take. Of course, the discussion about supervision and EU-wide enforcement and supervisory body, it's quite complex, but I think a GDPR could serve as a good example of making a framework which is applicable to all the players, has a number of tools to enforce and also introduce a cooperation mechanism for national authorities. I would be also happy to chip in a bit into the question of enforcement of what to actually do about it, because I think there's been a lot of interesting points. So I think there's this evolution of thinking in how to enforce regulations, and a good example for me is the 2017 regulation on cooperation on enforcement of consumer rules, which offers a number of tools to national authorities, even going as far as geo-blocking as a last resort measure. So these are really tools that are somehow fit to challenges of digital era. I was also very interesting hearing yesterday the interview of President of the Commission, who said that this Digital Services Act could require platforms to establish themselves as businesses entities in Europe, which indeed would improve the opportunity for consumers and for authorities to enforce their rights and their competence. So I think we're going in a good direction. I would be quite optimistic about where we're going, but we really need to act now. So the legislator really need to act now. And last point, if you allow, on data, I think that when Martin was speaking about this dilemma of companies saying we don't want to be regulated, and politicians and consumers saying we do want to be regulated, I think the best solution is to some extent have an enforceability test. So rules are good, and it's very good to have a legal certainty, but as long as these rules are not effectively enforceable against all the players, then these rules might limit the opportunity to innovate, but actually do not address all the challenges that we're facing. So I hope this offers a solution, and this will be applied when we talk about how to use data and how to use AI in this upcoming regulation, so that all the companies have the opportunity to build their services in a way that respects fundamental values, but also which allows them to analyze data, to use data more freely, and eventually to gain competitive advantage.
Do you think that those regulations that cannot be fairly applied so that everyone obeys them should be lifted, or just abandoned for 1 year, 2 years? Or you have another view of how to tackle this problem? Because there is a need for consumers to be protected. So how to solve this conundrum?
So I'm a lawyer, so to a lawyer to ask whether legal rules should be suspended for 2 years, it's a quite provocative question. So
Of course it is.
I think that's not the solution. But I would say that maybe some kind of enforceability test while we think about new regulations could be helpful. So we want to introduce new rules, but what tools do we actually have, do authorities have, or consumers have, to enforce these rules versus all the players, all the companies that they may buy products or services at the digital single market. I think that if we think more and more under this term, we will be able to craft great legislation, but also ensure that all the players play under the same rules.
Thank you. One of our viewers shared his comment. I would like to cite right now. That's a comment from Mario Grzegorczyk. I think he agrees with you, Magda. He tells that we are not at the beginning of the road, but I think acceleration should be much greater, of course, in the case of supporting EU tax. And he gives an advice that the EU should already think and work on how to, for example, organize the upcoming elections and how citizens will be able to limit the handling of administrative matters in offices and transfer most of their activities in the network. So he's giving some examples of what to do and how to help EU tax. Maybe you, Gianpiero, have some also comments on what should be the priorities in funding and in favor regulations. What should be the priority right now? As you told, there is a paradigm shift. So what are the new priorities under the new paradigm?
For sure, the first probably is to leverage, to push up the 100 billion fund that the Commission announced in the documents of August of the last year, because it can be a way to leverage the funding for European industry in a very, very strong way. So probably this is the first priority. The second priority is to guarantee and to help the European digital industry to have the right velocity to be competitive. And this means to have the rules, regulations, and environment that helps to have this kind of industry that is not done, as I told before, only from the web companies or the company that are enabled by technology, but also by technology vendors. FacilityLive, for example, is a technology vendor, and we need technology vendors in Europe to have the base of technologies that guarantees to all the industry to be competitive in the innovation area. And I repeat, the third is a CEO roundtable, not seminar, a CEO roundtable that can, but it was my fault because the connection was not so clear, so I told in a bad way seminal and not seminar, but it was my pronoun, sorry, I apologize for this, to create a CEO roundtable where all the main actors of this period in the digital arena will be discussing the future, not only of the digital industry in Europe, but of the Europe itself, because it's impossible to think a competitive Europe without a digital industry competitive, European digital industry competitive in the world.
Okay, thank you. We are right now running out of time. It's 11 o'clock in Warsaw. I would like to give still one last couple of minutes to you to have some summing up of today's event, because we just touched upon summit of the topics that are important for digital market in Europe. And I have one last question. If you would like to answer, please do. If not, I know it's tricky, about the digital tax, because we were talking a lot about funding, and we need money to have it to spend. So we need money to spend. So maybe a digital tax is a solution. I know that there is some work going on for the digital tax as well, and some of our viewers are very interested in what's going on in this topic. So if you would like to share your views, whether is it going forward or we won't have a EU-wide digital tax, go on with it. But still, feel free to give your summing up comments on this event. We'll start in the very same order as we started the whole discussion. So with Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. If I may just make one small point on the on regulation and regulation of AI that that Magdalena mentioned. I mean, I think we do have a few too many lawyers around the table. I'm a lawyer myself, and one thing we would really have to think about as well is equipping the regulator. The regulator needs the expertise. If you are talking about sophisticated artificial intelligence technology, when you're talking about deep neural networks, what is the level of understanding of lawyers, of economists, of the standard regulators, of how extremely complex deep neural networks with hundreds of thousands of synaptic levers that power that network, how are we going to understand that? How are we going to regulate that? So sometimes what I'm trying to say here is the actual enforcement of these standards of rules. We want to push explainability of algorithms, of these black boxes. This is going to be an enormous challenge, and we may have to think about this, a personal thought, that we will have to equip better our regulators and not have just economists and lawyers, but we have physicists and biologists and data scientists. And there's an enormous lack of these around all regulators in the world. So if we're going to be serious about regulating, because everybody likes to talk about rules and enforcing rules, but it will be extremely challenging and difficult in practice. On the digital tax, yes. I mean, we say in Europe, if you want to have activities in Europe, you should be fairly taxed in Europe. And I think the executive vice president Vestager said that if there are not rules on fair rules on digital taxation, or rather taxation of the big tech companies in OECD level, then we will push for them at Commission level. And there's already a reference to this in the financing for our recovery fund. I would remind everyone, though, that taxation requires unanimity among the member states. So all 27 member states have to agree. There's no qualified majority voting. It requires unanimity. So if we have unanimity in all the member states, including Poland, fully agree with this, then the measure is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for your valuable comments. And now let's turn to Eva Maydell. Please share your views.
Thank you. I think it was a very insightful event, and your messages resonated very clearly. As I said, I think there is a positive momentum, and the EU tech sector has to build on it. And I hope we as legislators, not just thinking of myself, but in a broad way for the entire parliament and colleagues in the respective committees, would take into account the principle that I use in my work, which is regulation for innovation. Now more than ever would be necessary to give a little bit more of a push to European players in their doings, in order for them on one hand to use the available funding, but on the other have rules that are going to work as an enabler for them. Briefly on your concrete question, Martin basically addressed it in its full scope. I would just like to add that we currently have some member states that do have their national digital taxes. So this does not create a level playing field throughout Europe. It's a multi-layer approach, and we need to have one overall approach, whether through the OECD or whether through a European tech tax. However, I think when we speak about own resources, that's going to be a long and lengthy discussion, and I more likely would see it finding its way into introducing a similar tax in a different domain first, rather than the tech sector, whether that would be plastic or something else. But it's a lengthy discussion. I remember some weeks ago in an interview, I mentioned that would take probably a few years to negotiate, and the business sitting opposite on the interview was like, what do you mean? Because in business terms, that's way too long. But we need to have, when it comes so far, currently, the rules are that when it comes to tax, it has to be an anonymity decision. But having said that, I would be very glad keeping in touch and discussing the key legislative files that are on their way to come by the end of the year and also next year, in order for us to make sure, but also to amplify the voice of European tech sector and SMEs to make sure that they see those legislations as helping them grow, but most importantly, supporting their innovative models. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. And now I turn to Magdalena Piech from Allegro and EUTA. Please. Magda, we still need your microphone, even in the end.
Sorry, this is Zoom time or COVID time.
We have all the same problems.
Reality. So thank you very much for this insightful discussion and your comments of all the panelists. Maybe I would conclude by making 3 points. I think that when it comes to regulation, what we need is indeed a proportionality and a targeted approach, but also this enforceability of regulation. So making sure that it is binding and enforceable to all the players on the market that competes for the same consumer, for the same businesses with their services. Second point I would make is the coherence of regulation will be key in ensuring that the goals that digital single market should achieve are achieved. So the coherence of data strategy and AI and GDPR and competition and P2B regulation, it all has to be ensured for companies to have this nurturing framework. Last but not least, I think that this kind of discussions that we have today, the exchange and the consultation that are ongoing, are a very good way to engage and look for such solutions. So I would like to declare that we are very willing to support and contribute constructively to this discussion.
Thank you. And of course, last but not least, Gianpiero Lotito.
The mic. Okay. Yeah. Digital tax, this is a personal opinion. Digital tax can be very important if contribute to rebalance the competition between who pay the taxes in a place and who don't pay in that place, because this is very, very important to have the same level of possibility to compete. And the second reason why digital tax can be important is if is used to use part of the tax to finance the sector, the digital industry, particularly in the seed phase when we need to enforce the youngest part of the industry. But I close with two things. First of all, congratulations to Polityka and to Allegro for this initiative. The report was really clear and very simple to catch the main points that we need to follow in Europe in this moment in the digital battle. And second thing, we need to remember that in Europe we need European tech champions at the level of the other two blocks, because we have an imbalance in this moment that is create an impossibility to be competitive. So we need to grow tech champions at a different level from the current. So all the things that the EU Commission can make in the next future are fundamental to win the battle.
Thank you, Gianpiero. Thank you to all of you for the insightful discussion. And I would like also to thank all the technological companies that enabled this discussion today, from Polish startups through EU tax, also to global tax, where you could watch us. So thank you. Without EU tax and without technological companies, we could not make this discussion today. So hopefully this is just the beginning of the road, and we'll talk on this topic extensively in the forthcoming months. So hopefully we can see each other also in real, not only in the virtual reality. To all of the viewers, thank you for watching, thank you for asking questions and giving us likes, and see each other again. Once again, have a great day, and thank you.
Thank you very much.